This is going to be an introduction for the first project within the MAT 135 class, Graphic Design 1. So to give you some understanding, whenever you would click to go to the assignment section in Canvas, one of the things that you're going to find is that we have grouped assignments that fall under a weighted category of a project, right? So for instance, this one, Project 1.0, Project 1, Foundation Design Book, this project, essentially what it is it's a culmination of all these different discrete and separate assignments that have grade associations with them attached to them, and they all add up to be 100 points or 100%, so that gives us the full grade basis for this project 1, and then you'll see over here that it's 35% of the total semester grade. So if you were to click on any one of these things, what it's going to do is take you to a discussion board. Now, the assignments are not discussions. So one of the strategies that I've used in this class is that instead of doing a traditional assignment where you turn your work in and nobody else can see it or comment on it, what you're going to be doing is uploading your work to a discussion board. And so your grade comes from that discussion. But it's not necessarily that your grade is based on what you say in a discussion. It is based on what you turn in, but the value in having it in a discussion board is that then what you turn in is something that everybody else can see, and likewise you can see other people's work. And so it's a great way to share in the class, and especially in an online class, it works out very well. One of the things that you can do right off the bat is you can click right here where it says P1 begin here, and one of the things that you'll notice immediately before you click is that you'll see that down here on these other ones, there's some little pieces of information about when things are due and so on. And by the way, these dates, if it's a different semester, they might look a little bit different. So don't worry about it if it's different in the video than what you see in your class. But one thing you will notice is that right here, there is a point assignment on all of these assignments. And this is where I said, you know, it adds up to be 100. So we've got 25, 10, 15, 15, 10, and 25. That ends up to be 100. You'll notice that this top one where it says begin here, there's no point assignment. Just so you know, it'll show up in my grade book as either you completed it or you didn't complete it, meaning you basically you checked it out. There's no submission, but it's for you to go back into review. So if you were to click here, it's going to take you to this page where it says P1. It's always going to stand for project 1. If you see P1, P2, P3, P4, those are going to be the major project groups for the entire semester. And some projects will have more sub-assignments than others. Anyway, but this is going to be the page where you can learn a little bit. Now, some of the features right here in Canvas, like this publish, unpublish, edit, you're not going to have access to that. Only I do. So don't worry about that. But the assignment information is still here. One thing that I tell you right here, I've already mentioned, is that this is ungraded, but it is going to help you understand the scope. And the other thing is that if you don't understand something about the first project, you feel free to ask questions right here so that I will answer. So the overview and goals, right, and it says right here, Project 1, which is the Foundation Design Book, is a grouping of smaller assignments which spans several weeks that ultimately lead to a common set of goals. And those goals are understanding foundational design principles, that's the first one, learning to manipulate form, also learning how to use standard design software to communicate ideas through visual design, seeing how these principles create the foundation of all aspects of design, regardless of complexity. And when I say seeing, I don't mean just looking, I mean really understanding. That you'll learn, I've got a duplicate that, sorry about that, I'll fix that too. Learning that the iterative design process is crucial in creating strong and inventive work. And we'll talk a little bit more as we go what iterative means. I mean, basically it means you do a lot of iterations, a lot of versions. So you don't just settle on the first or second thing that you come up with, you keep going and see what works best. And finally, creating an end product that documents your best refined foundational studies to illustrate that you understand these principles, and the process and the work ethic that is essentially required for graphic design. And so this is what I mentioned before about grading. You can take a look here and have links here to each assignment if you want to jump out there from here, and it's got the point or the percentage values. Okay, and then you'll see that all of those values from phases 0 through 5, they all end up to be 100%, but the entire group is going to be weighted for 35% of the semester grade. Okay, so what to expect, and then this video, or it says video here, it's the video I'm recording right now, so it's a walkthrough. The other thing too is that I give you a basic folder structure. One of the things is that I've taught this class before in an on-ground environment, and so I have decided to kind of change the phases up a little bit. And so in some of the videos, you might find that I'm working from a certain folder structure that doesn't really necessarily resemble our phase setup anymore. And so I want to go ahead and pull this here in the very beginning, so that you can be organized from the start and not feel confused. And so what I've done is I've provided a screenshot of my recommendation to you for your folder structure, where you've got a major project folder. In this case, mine is MAT 135 Project 1. And then inside of that folder, I have a folder that just says examples. So like if you decide that you want to download any examples of student work or something, you can put it here. But otherwise, you can keep everything that's related to phase 0, which is going to be sort of like the photography phase where you're walking out and you're learning how to see design in the physical world and capturing that and putting it together in a visual format. And phase 1, which is going to be where you're doing some studies that have a lot of restrictions. And then phase 2 is based off of phase 1, where you take your phase 1 studies and then you start modifying them based on a set of criteria. Phase 3 is going to introduce something new that's a graphic element and letter form. Phase 4 is where you're going to refine your graphic element studies, your letter form studies, and your other point, line, and plane modified studies from phases 2 and 3. And finally, phase 5 is where you do some other stuff that kind of culminates into some applied formal layouts based on all the other stuff that you've learned, and you put it in a book form, okay? And so this folder structure right here, I made an empty, sort of like an empty shell of a folder structure. You can download it here so that you don't have to type all of this stuff if you want to follow mine. Just know that it's basically going to be like slightly different than some of the early videos in this first project. And as I said before, that is because I've modified this project a little bit. So you would just be saving your things from these assignments in the most logical folders. Okay, so the other thing is, oh, and by the way, this is a zipped file. So if you download it, it's a compressed file. On Windows, you'll have to right click and extract all. And if you're on Mac, you'll just double click it and you'll work from the folder that results from opening that zipped file. Okay, if you have any questions, feel free to go and just hit the reply button on this particular assignment. And if for any reasons you have problems with that, you can always email me, that's fine too. Then just dive in, right? Go ahead and click on this phase 1, project 1 phase 0, I should say, learning how to see, and that's the photography phase. And so let's just go ahead and jump to that. And you'll see kind of where we're going to start. The beginning is where we start doing some investigations, where you're going to go out and take photographs. You're not going to ever be allowed to use stock photography. I tell you that right here. And I do want you to read this. I'm not going to go over everything, but you're going to end up taking images that based on your readings from your textbook and based on some of the stuff that we talk about in class, you're going to go out and you're going to find examples of point, line, plane, texture, and letter forms that exist out in the physical world. And you're going to be cropping those and placing them into 9-unit grids for each topic, and so that they are color coordinated. You're going to learn how to color correct. You're going to learn how to use artboards and Photoshop to do all of this. Makes it a lot easier. And then also how to export your stuff out as square cropped images, which also is going to teach you about framing and learning how to see things, and whether you're going to zoom in on stuff to capture the relationships, these fundamental design relationships. All right, essentially here's your point breakdown for this particular assignment. It's based off of 100%, even though it's worth so many points towards the whole project. I look at my grading for each individual assignment as sort of everything that's inside of it has to equal to 100%, because that is what makes sense to a lot of us. I find it kind of confusing sometimes whenever you've got like 15 points or and then or 20 points or 10 points or whatever. So what I do is I just will give you a percentage, and that way you can look at that particular assignment and go, oh yeah, okay, I got an A or I got a B or whatever. And then I walk you through how to do stuff. In fact, I have some very explicit tutorials that will walk you right through how to do everything. All right, and so that's what this is. And you'll notice that it's a playlist. So if you click on this, you'll see that there are 2 videos in this playlist that show you how to do all of that stuff. And then on these videos, when you click them, so if I were to click this, all right, I'm going to pause it real quick so it doesn't make noise, but you can go to full screen like this so that you can start watching it, and then it'll automatically advance to the other second video that's in the playlist. All right, and it basically shows you how to do a lot of your assignment. Then whenever you've taken your pictures, you're going to be putting your photographs into PowerPoint. I'm not having you do something like InDesign just because that's a pretty complicated program, and I don't want to throw too much at you at the beginning of the semester. Most of you guys probably have some familiarity with PowerPoint, but for those of you who don't, I also have a tutorial right here that you can watch that will help you get your assignment completed. You're going to export your stuff out as a PDF, and then you're going to upload it here. And then I have some student example work that you can look at to see kind of like what it is that is going to be expected of you. And if we just take a second really quickly, I'm going to jump over here and we can take a peek at some of those things. Now this is not the layout or format that you're going to be doing, that you're going to be using, that I'm showing you right now. This is just a PDF that I made of previous student work. So this is an example of, how to find point images in the natural world where you walk around with a camera. And this is a little bit harder than you might think. Whenever you are walking around, a lot of times some of this little stuff, like inside the flower and the dog's eyes and nose and stuff, those are things whenever you're standing from far away, you might not really see those really small details, and as a result they don't really represent point. And what I mean by point are basically, it's like dots. It's a really fundamental concept of not only design but of geometry, right? Because if you think of design in terms of geometry, that's a really fundamental thing, as a point in space. Anyway, so these are some examples of point, and I do talk about this more in a video that is specific to this assignment. So, here's some examples from other students in the past who have done this, right? Right. So that's just one thing that you would do. You would go out and you would take a minimum of 9 pictures. I recommend you take more because then you've got more to choose from. And then you're going to end up putting them into Photoshop and creating a grid and exporting stuff. And I go through all of that, right? And then you can start to see some examples of line, that you're going to start to look for examples of line in the physical natural world. I mean, this is a pair of jeans, for instance. This is a bunch of laminated plywood together. All right, this is zoomed in on the grout lines, of some bricks. Okay. All right, some other examples like of drawing and, you know, shadows on the wall and so forth. Okay. So you get the idea, right? And then let's go back, and you're also going to be looking for plane. Basically, you're looking for, and you'll also be able to read about this in your textbook, but planes are going to be planar surfaces and typically represented in rectilinear formats. They don't have to be, but we're going to stick with basic squares and rectangles for right now to discuss plane. We're not going to go into other kinds of planar shapes. And then you can see that these are how some people ended up, taking photographs and cropping stuff. And then another thing that you're going to do is you're going to look out for texture. And again, I'm not going to go into what texture is right now. That gets kind of into the scope of the assignment. But you can, see some different people's not just ideas of what texture is, but also their, just their capturing of it. All right, and so we can look at texture as something that's tactile, but also like in this down here, this example, this is sort of like pattern. And then you can also pay attention to like where does tactile texture overlap with pattern texture, like in this wicker basket weave. You can see that that definitely has a distinct pattern, but also you can almost hear a noise that it would make for you to run your finger along that and stuff, right? So some more examples. And then another thing to pay attention to is like how this layout works, like, where the color is in relationship to other color from these different pictures. And like, for instance, like this is really well done. There's this little doll, or it's like a ceramic head, and then it's cropped in a beautiful way with the shell right above it so that it feels like, an extension of the head and maybe hair, which is, I think, quite lovely. And then here's this is very much about pattern. This one was paying attention to rhythm, repetition, and patterning. This one too. Okay, whereas the other ones were a little bit more focused on tactile qualities, even though some of them did deal with pattern as well. And then lastly, you're going to go out and look for examples in the world of letter forms, typography, right? And there are two different ways that I talk to you about what you can do, and one of them is going to be that you can either look for stuff in the natural world where you're looking for type that you see in signs and just everywhere, that exists as actual text in places. But what I'd really like for you to do is challenge yourself even more and do something like this, where you start to try to see how you can visually crop things as you're just looking around to find letter forms in the natural world that just exist. Like this is, for instance, up here, this is one of those retaining wall blocks looking down, and it's like the holes that you could put either rock, sand, or concrete in, and it looks like the letter B. This is a garden hose just laying on the ground that looked like a G. This is where two pieces of concrete were meeting, and it looked really different from a distance, but if you sort of focused in on something and you start really paying attention to the world around you, you start to see things crop out like a letter K. This is upside down. This was a little drawer pull. Right side up, it didn't look like much, but upside down, looks like the letter L, and so on and so on. You get the idea, right? And here's some other examples. Student work. Okay, and this is really all in the cropping. You can definitely see how this handbar would not look like a letter D from a distance, but somebody's really looking closely. This is letter J and so on. Okay, you get the idea. And then there's some other examples like of finding type in signs. Okay, like existing typography that are out there. This is where somebody was really focused on words. A lot of these are from movie and TV posters. So I really kind of went in depth on the first part of the assignment, first part of the project, which is the photography assignment. And the reason for that is because we are going to hit that first, right? And so that's the first thing you're going to be focusing on. We'll spend a little bit of time on that. A lot of this is going to be informed by your reading, like what is point, what is line, what is plane. I want you to read your book. It's a really good book. Okay, so that's the first assignment, and you'll see that the first assignment is basically 25 points, or in the way I look at it, because everything adds up to be 100, it's 25% of your entire project one total. Each grid is going to be worth essentially 5% of that first project. So take it seriously. And the other thing too about this, and means you should really take it seriously, is that you're going to have to end up putting a lot of this in your book in the end. So if you don't do it now, you're going to have to do it later anyway. Otherwise, you're going to lose points. Sort of, it's going to hit you twice. So make sure you do a good job on that. The next assignment, which is phase 1, right? So the last one was, I called it phase 0. I'm a computer person. Computers start counting at 0. So forgive me. Anyway, this is phase 1, where you start getting into identical scale exploration studies, and this is where you start dealing with point, line, and plane in a vector environment. So we use Adobe Illustrator, and don't worry if you don't know how to use it. I show you exactly how to make stuff, and you're going to learn a lot about how to use Adobe Illustrator if you don't already know. And if you do know, perfect, that makes it that much better. And I found that a lot of people who know Illustrator actually learn a little bit in the class too anyway for some little tips and tricks. And then again, it walks you right through it. What I'm going to do is jump over down here to the sort of creative part, right, which is, it says step 4, not in video, right? You'll read up here that in this playlist, it covers steps 1, 2, 3, and 5, where these are all sort of the technical, like file setup and how to get started and all that. But the step 4 part is just in the written area here, and you're going to need to follow these instructions. It gives you like a really specific set of restrictions about what you can do with your objects that you're creating, and the arrangements, and it tells you can't use scale on any of the objects because they all start off in an identical scale, and I tell you exactly how big to make them. You can't change the rotational axis on any of them. You can't overlap or intersect them. You can't change the color. You're not supposed to put a stroke around objects. You're not supposed to alter the dimensions of the artboards that I show you how to create. So these are really, really strict, and a lot of times students are like, what's the point? You'll see as you progress through the project what that point is. It really helps you understand the guiding principles and the elements of design. And then just because they are so restrictive, I kind of give you some words that you can work with in order to think about the meaning of the arrangements that you're making so that they don't feel haphazard and random. And so you can think about what some of the things that you're doing look like, like what does conflict look like? If you were to have some sort of interpretation of it, what does playfulness look like? Even whenever you can't scale, you can't rotate, you can't intersect and all of that, right? And then in part C, I talked to you about how to think about some questions as you're doing this so that you start to really be able to understand what it is that you're working with. And so here's some example images that show you some other interpretations that another student did. And you'll see like this one I think was playful, this one was playful, and you'll notice that nothing is intersecting or scaled, or this one I believe is probably, it's either order or congestion. This one again would be probably congestion. This is probably conflict because there's one off here. This one's conflict, and so on. All right, and then with the line, you're also looking sort of at not just the words that I've given you and trying to portray those, but also thinking about how that affects the interval, like in what the feeling of passage of time, for instance, and then you deal with the planes as well. Basically, when you're done, you're going to export out all of your artboards, and you're going to create one big PDF, and you're going to upload them to this discussion, right? That's the phase 1. This is phase 2 assignment, worth 15% of the project. And this is where you get to have a little bit more fun. You take your phase 1 stuff, you duplicate the files, and you start modifying them. I talked to you about how to do a lot of those things in Illustrator, but also based on some of the things you're going to read in your book and that we'll talk about. And then you'll see that there's some former examples. I'll just jump to some of those over here. All right, so for instance, you saw the last pictures of point, by the way. You saw that those looked pretty basic. Well, as soon as you can start adding rotational axis changes, you can start doing scale, you can start intersecting and overlapping to give a sense of depth. You start to get something that's a little bit more interesting, then you can get some other results that start to feel a little more interesting. And then I also allow you to do things with stroke here. And you really get a sense, like especially from this one, a sense of depth as well, right? And this is plane. And then, this one, it looks like a big chunk is missing, but that's just it's a really large one. And then you'll notice also that these only have 5. And so on the ones where it looks like there aren't 5, there are, but it's because it's doing an intersection and it's doing a knockout of the intersection. So that's 1 square, 2 square, 3 square, 4 square, 5 square, or I should say plane. This one is a representation of order kind of, and anyway, you get the idea. So here's interval with line. Okay, and then this actually, this big black section is actually a line, and where you start to play around with the stroke and you start to get an understanding of how the thickness of the stroke really changes your interpretation of what a line is. Like the scaling of that stroke is scaling of the line, and it makes it feel like it's a lot closer to you and bigger, and it also starts to look more like a plane, the closer it is. And so you start to think about those kinds of things. You can start messing with intersection. Okay. Anyway, you get the idea. Oh, there's some more points. I guess they're a little out of order. Okay, and then also you can, I allow you to also change the way that the borders are. Like for instance, this is a border that uses dashes, as you can see. Okay, all right, so you get the idea. And this is for the modified studies, and this is another really interesting take, for instance. Okay, so you can really see some different interpretations of this. All right, I'm going to go ahead and get out of this. I'm not going to go through all of it. And then the next phase, let's go and jump back over here. Right, we're going to get into introducing graphic elements. And one of the things that you'll see is that I give you, I've drawn these objects. I give you this file, and then you have to use these graphic elements. You can't use other graphic elements. You have to use the ones that I've provided for you. And you have to make compositions with these so that you can start thinking about shapes as things other than just, circles and squares and lines, and you start to think about how these things are actually comprised of other shapes and how these make shapes and patterns and things. If you go back, let's jump back over to here. All right, and then we can look at this phase, and this is where we also start thinking about depth perception with scaling and overlapping shapes and how those things really come into play once you start making those adjustments. So this is a section of that phase where you're doing icon compositions, okay? And this is an icon composition, right? And then this is really interesting because the object really starts looking completely different. And then we also deal with things like foreground and background, and it's called figure ground, where you can't tell what is foreground and what is background, and the shapes become ambiguous, and it's referred to as tension. Okay, so we start getting into this stuff. All right, and then the other thing that we start, and this is a good example of figure ground or foreground and background. And then we get into also a little bit later, and this is just the icon study, right? And then we get into pattern, which is a little bit different. We start talking about pattern and repetition and grid structure and things like that. Okay. And so these are some examples, and all of this starts, from the concept of those dots and lines and squares, right? Okay, so you get the idea. Okay, I'm going to just get out of that. There are several more, and then let's jump over here. And then finally, we do letter form, where you're going to be using your initials, and you're going to start learning how you can look at letter forms as shapes, inherent shapes, and how you can use scale and other kinds of really interesting tools to create these cool vector compositions with typography. Okay, and so these are some different examples that people had, and like this is a really good example where the type starts to betray itself and it doesn't look like type anymore, right? It looks like shapes, but you can still get the sense of it, and you really also start to really, understand the inherent beauty and elegance of typography when you look at it very, very closely. I think a lot of us take type for granted, in the beginning until we start learning more about it. And so you can really explore this, right? And you start looking at how things have motion or movement based on their orientation. Like this is something that was, has intersection. This one is a stroke with a white fill. And so this is also really interesting because it feels very different. All right. Okay. Anyway, so you get the idea. All right? And that's phase 3. And then we get into phase 4 where we start doing alignment. I'm not going to go over any pictures of stuff, but I show you how to do alignment stuff in Illustrator and how to use the pen tool. There's some videos that'll help you. That's 10% because you don't have to refine all of what you've done, but you do have to refine 2 of your best from each category. Okay, so that ends up being like 12 compositions that you end up refining. And then the final phase is where you start applying what you've done. And the first part of that is that you create a combined point line and plane composition. Actually, you create 2 of those. So here's some examples, for instance, and you can look at these examples. In fact, let's take a look. These are combinations, and here you're not restricted to, only using, you don't have to use 5 circles and 5 lines and 5 squares. You can change that up a little bit. These are some other compositions that people have done. All right, you can see how dynamic some of this is, but then the point is you're also going to go after you do that and you're going to find some images referred to as a found image so that you can give these some context. So you're going to end up choosing something that has meaning. Either it can be like a social campaign or something that's kind of commercial or whatever, right? Some inspirational. And you're going to find some images. You're going to work with those to help you figure out the text that you're going to put in there, right? And these are some of the pictures that people found, okay? And then what you're going to end up doing is making a combination of those. So you're going to do, here's an example of somebody's, and he wasn't really supposed to use value here, where it is in grayscale. That is not something you're supposed to do. He actually went back and he modified that. I should have gone back and modified it so you didn't get the wrong idea. But the point is, this was a basic arrangement, and then he took this picture of people graduating, and he ended up making this layout based off of that combination. And you see this person's point line plane combo here, the picture, and then off to the right is the combination with text. And notice too, it's kind of important. Notice in a lot of these, some of them have blocks of text or lines of text that, like this isn't an example of what I'm talking about, but let me see if I can find one where, yeah, see, for instance, this line could be represented by text, right? It doesn't have to even have that line. It could be where the line is. Another example. Let me see if I can find an example specifically. This is a good example, actually. See, you've got these 3 lines that are coming off the circle here, and then those lines are represented in text over on this side. All right, and so they're not literally physical lines, but the text become line. This is another good example of that concept. And you see that we're also doing image masking. And so some of the squares could be represented just as text. Some of them could be the images that are masked. And you'll notice that the image, it has a continuation. Same is true with this one. Right, so you start to see how these things kind of come together. Okay, and then suddenly these circles and squares and lines, they're not as, when you start seeing them as layout components, it starts making a whole lot more sense. The other last part of that project is once you've done all of that, you're going to put everything together. And I show you how, and I also show you an example down here, but I'll show you also again, is you're going to put everything together using a PowerPoint download file that you can use as the base file. And then what you're going to do is put all of your best work. Let's go back here. And you can look at this. I'm going to go over here to page display. We'll do a 2-page spread. And let's go ahead and look at this full screen. So, no, I can't do that actually. We can only look at it like this if we want. There we go. Yeah, so this is the 2-page spread where, so your name would go here. All right, and so this is, each section is going to have the photography kind of, as the opener. And then you've got your identical points. You're going to pick the 2 that are most intriguing. And then you're going to pick your points that are from your modified, refined studies and put those in the book. And then you've got your line, right? Same is true here. Plane, all right, same is going to be true again. And then you've got texture. All right, so we have just the icon compositions, and then we have the pattern compositions, and we get to letter form photography section, and then we do the letter form studies that have been refined and cleaned up. And then we get to the application studies where, we've got the composition, right? The geometric composition with the picture, and then we see the results. And so that's going to be your book, and that's going to be the final part of that assignment, okay? And so this is the fundamental point of the whole first project as an introduction that should help you kind of see what we're doing from point A to get to point Z, so that it kind of makes sense to you. And to keep everything manageable, all of these separate chunks that we're going to be working through, they're going to be set up as separate assignments, right? And then, as I said before, all of those assignments go towards a project group grade that gets weighted for 35% of the full semester. Okay, so let me know if you have any questions, and I'm happy to help.